Welcome, dear friends, to another journey into the heart of Buddhist wisdom. I'm so glad you're here with me today, settling into this quiet moment together. Whether you're listening while the sun rises, or perhaps as the day winds down and you're looking for some gentle guidance, you found the right place. You know, there's something beautiful about the way ancient stories can speak to our modern hearts, isn't there? Today, I want to share with you a story that happened many years ago in a small monastery tucked away in the mountains of Tibet. It's a story about a young monk named Tenzin, and I think you'll find that his struggles might sound surprisingly familiar. But before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you're stuck in a cycle? Maybe you wake up each morning with good intentions, promising yourself that today will be different. Today you'll meditate longer, be more patient, be more present. But then the day unfolds, and somehow you find yourself right back where you started, feeling a bit disappointed with yourself. If you're nodding along, you're not alone. This feeling, this sense of being caught in patterns we wish we could break free from, is something the Buddha spoke about over 2,000 years ago. He called it samsara, the wheel of cyclic existence, and it's not just about grand spiritual concepts. It's about those small, daily moments when we feel trapped by our own habits and reactions. Our young monk Tenzin knew this feeling all too well. Picture him for a moment. He's about 25 years old, with kind eyes that used to sparkle with curiosity and joy. When he first arrived at the monastery 5 years earlier, he was like a bright flame, eager to learn, quick to help others, always the first one awake for morning prayers. The older monks would smile when they saw him, remembering their own early enthusiasm for the Dharma. But something had shifted over the past year. That bright flame had begun to flicker and dim. Tenzin found himself sleeping through the morning bell, his meditation cushion gathering dust. When the abbot would give teachings, Tenzin's mind would wander to worries and doubts. Am I cut out for this path? He'd wonder. Other monks seem to progress so naturally, but I feel like I'm going backwards. The beautiful thing about monastery life is that nothing stays hidden for long. When you live in such close community, when your days are structured around shared meals and shared silence, people notice when someone's light grows dim. And the first person to notice Tenzin's struggle was his teacher, the old abbot named Lobsang. Abbot Lobsang was one of those rare beings who seemed to carry peace in his very presence. He had weathered many storms in his 70 years, both in the world and in his own heart. His hair was silver white, his face lined with wrinkles that spoke of both deep laughter and profound compassion. When he walked through the monastery gardens, even the birds seemed to grow quieter, as if they too wanted to listen to whatever wisdom he might share. For weeks, Abbot Lobsang watched Tenzin with the patient attention of a gardener observing a struggling plant. He saw how the young monk would sit in meditation but fidget restlessly. He noticed how Tenzin would volunteer for tasks, but then complete them half-heartedly. Most telling of all, he saw how Tenzin had begun to avoid eye contact, carrying his shoulders like they bore the weight of the world. One evening, as the sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and purple, Abbot Lobsang found Tenzin sitting alone by the monastery's small pond, staring at his reflection in the still water. The water shows us exactly what we bring to it, the abbot said gently, settling beside him on the stone bench. If we come with a storm in our hearts, we see turbulence. If we come with stillness, we see clarity. Tenzin looked up a bit startled. I'm sorry, Rinpoche. I should be preparing for evening prayers. The prayers will wait, Abbot Lobsang replied with a warm smile. But I think there's something more important we need to tend to first. Tomorrow morning, after the bells ring, I'd like you to meet me in the practice garden. There's something I want to show you. Tenzin nodded, though he couldn't imagine what lesson awaited him. He had already learned about meditation postures, about the breath, about the nature of mind. What more could there be? What Tenzin didn't know was that he was about to discover one of the most profound teachings the Buddha ever offered, wrapped up in the simplest of actions. A teaching that would change not just his days, but the very way he understood the path to freedom. And that, dear friends, is where our story truly begins. Now, to truly understand what happened next in our story, we need to look more closely at what was happening in Tenzin's heart. You see, the Buddha taught us about the first noble truth, which is the truth of dukkha, or suffering. But this isn't the dramatic kind of suffering we might think of. It's often much more subtle, much more personal. For Tenzin, it had started so gradually that he barely noticed at first. Like many of us, he thought he was just having a few bad days. We've all been there, haven't we? You wake up one morning and meditation feels harder than usual. Your mind is more restless. Your heart feels heavier. Tomorrow will be better, you tell yourself. And sometimes it is. But sometimes, tomorrow brings the same heaviness, and the day after that, and the day after that. What Tenzin was experiencing is something the Buddha described as one of the most painful forms of suffering, the suffering of constant change, of impermanence. But not in the way we usually think about it. This wasn't about losing something he loved. This was about watching himself change in ways he didn't want to change. Let me paint you a picture of what his days had become. The monastery bell would ring at 4:30 in the morning, just as it had for hundreds of years. This sound used to be like music to Tenzin's ears, a gentle invitation to begin the day with gratitude and practice. But now, when that bell echoed across the mountain valley, Tenzin would pull his blanket over his head and think, just 5 more minutes. Just 5 more minutes, and then I'll get up and be the monk I'm supposed to be. But 5 minutes would become 10, then 15, then 20. By the time he finally dragged himself from his small bed, the other monks would already be seated in the meditation hall, their backs straight, their breath steady, their minds turning toward the Dharma. Tenzin would slip in late, trying to be quiet, but the old wooden floor would creak under his feet, and he'd feel 20 pairs of eyes notice his tardiness without judgment, which somehow made it worse. You know that feeling when you're disappointing people who are too kind to say anything. That gentle weight of knowing you're not living up to your own potential, let alone theirs. That's what Tenzin carried with him into every meditation session. He'd sit on his cushion, close his eyes, and try to find his breath. But instead of the peace he used to find there, his mind would immediately begin its familiar dance of worry. I'm late again. I'm a terrible monk. Look at Pema over there. He's probably already reached some deep state of concentration, while I can't even count 10 breaths without getting distracted. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I should just go back to my village and help my father with the barley harvest. The Buddha taught that our minds create our reality, and Tenzin's mind had become a very uncomfortable place to live. What made it even more painful was that he remembered what it felt like when practice was joyful, when sitting in meditation felt like coming home to himself, rather than sitting with an inner critic who never seemed to rest. After meditation, there would be morning chores. In the early days, Tenzin had loved this part of monastery life, sweeping the courtyard while the sun painted the mountains gold, tending to the vegetable garden that fed the community, helping in the kitchen where the older monks would share stories and gentle wisdom while they chopped vegetables and stirred pots of simple, nourishing soup. But now, these same activities felt like burdens. When it was his turn to sweep, he'd do it mechanically, his mind elsewhere, not noticing the way the morning light filtered through the prayer flags, not feeling the satisfaction of creating cleanliness and order. When he worked in the garden, he'd pull weeds with more force than necessary, as if he was angry at them for daring to grow where they weren't wanted. The kitchen duty was the hardest of all. The other monks would chat softly as they worked, sharing small observations about their practice, asking gentle questions about Dharma points that puzzled them, sometimes even laughing at the simple absurdities of daily life. But Tenzin felt like he was watching this warmth from behind a glass wall. He wanted to participate, to feel that sense of belonging and shared purpose, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he'd chop vegetables in silence, convinced that he had nothing valuable to contribute. Perhaps you recognize this feeling. It's that sense of being disconnected from the very things that used to bring you joy. The meditation cushion that once felt like a refuge now feels like a place of judgment. The spiritual books that used to inspire you now seem to mock your lack of progress. The community that once felt like family now feels like a group of people who have something figured out that you've somehow missed. Tenzin began to avoid the other monks during free time. Instead of joining them for informal discussions about the Dharma, he'd retreat to his small room and lie on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes he'd pick up a book of teachings, but the words would blur together. The wisdom that had once felt so alive, so applicable to his daily experience, now felt flat and theoretical. Attachment is the root of suffering, he'd read, and think, well, I'm attached to feeling miserable, so I guess that proves the point. The irony wasn't lost on him, but knowing the teaching intellectually didn't help him feel better. If anything, it made him feel worse because he knew what he should be doing but couldn't seem to do it. The worst part was the lying. Not big lies, but small ones that accumulated like pebbles in his shoe. When Abbot Lobsang would ask how his practice was going, Tenzin would say, "Fine, Rinpoche, just working through some things." When his Dharma brother Pema would invite him to walk in the mountains and discuss the morning's teaching, Tenzin would say he was too tired or had other things to do. And at night, when the monastery settled into its peaceful rhythm and the other monks drifted off to sleep with hearts full of gratitude for another day of practice, Tenzin would lie awake replaying all the ways he'd fallen short, all the opportunities for connection and growth he'd let slip by. This, dear friends, is what the Buddha meant when he spoke about the second arrow of suffering. The first arrow is the actual difficulty we face, the natural challenges of being human. But the second arrow is the suffering we create by fighting against the first arrow, by judging ourselves for our struggles, by creating stories about what our difficulties mean about us as people. Tenzin had been shot by many second arrows, and he didn't even realize he was the one holding the bow. But here's what gives me hope in this story, and what I hope gives you hope too. Even in his darkest moments, even when he felt most disconnected from his practice and his community, Tenzin never completely gave up. Something deep inside him kept him showing up, even when showing up felt like the hardest thing in the world. And that something, that tiny flame that refused to be completely extinguished, was about to be noticed by someone with the wisdom to help it grow bright again. The next morning came earlier than Tenzin would have liked, but for once, he didn't allow himself the luxury of those extra minutes under his blanket. Something about Abbot Lobsang's gentle invitation had stirred a tiny spark of curiosity in him, the first he'd felt in months. After the morning prayers, which he actually attended on time, he made his way to the practice garden as instructed. Now, this garden was a special place in the monastery. It wasn't where they grew vegetables or herbs for cooking. This was a space set aside purely for contemplation and outdoor meditation, a place where monks would go to practice walking meditation or simply sit quietly among the flowers. Ancient stone pathways wound between beds of marigolds and jasmine, and prayer flags fluttered gently in the mountain breeze, their colors faded by countless seasons of sun and rain. At the center of this garden stood something quite unremarkable, a simple wooden post about as tall as a person and as thick as your forearm. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, weathered smooth by decades of mountain weather. Most monks barely noticed it as they walked by, focused as they were on their breath or their mantras, or the feeling of their feet touching the earth. Tenzin found Abbot Lobsang sitting quietly on a stone bench near this post, his hands resting peacefully in his lap, his face turned slightly toward the morning sun. The abbot's presence had always been calming, but this morning there was something especially serene about him, as if he carried some secret knowledge that made even the birds sing more softly. "Ah, Tenzin," the abbot said without turning around, though Tenzin was certain he had approached silently. "Thank you for coming. Please sit with me." Tenzin settled onto the bench, not quite sure what to expect. In all his years at the monastery, he had never had a private teaching session in the garden. Usually, Dharma instruction happened in the formal setting of the teaching hall, with proper cushions and incense and all the traditional protocols. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Abbot Lobsang observed, and indeed it was. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wildflowers from the meadows below. "You know, I've been sitting in this garden for more than 40 years, and I never tire of mornings like this. Each one is completely unique, yet each one offers the same invitation to be present." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Tenzin found himself actually noticing his surroundings for the first time in weeks. The way the prayer flags cast shifting shadows on the path, the sound of water trickling from a small fountain somewhere nearby, the warmth of the sun on his face. For just a moment, he remembered what it felt like to be here, really here, instead of lost in the endless chatter of his worrying mind. Then, without any explanation or warning, Abbot Lobsang stood up, walked over to the wooden post, and picked up a small hammer that had been lying at its base. With one clean, deliberate movement, he struck the post once. The sound was sharp and clear in the morning air. Thok, that was it. One strike. Then the abbot set the hammer down exactly where he had found it and returned to the bench. Tenzin waited for the explanation, the teaching, the profound Dharma point that would surely follow. But Abbot Lobsang simply settled back into his meditation posture and closed his eyes, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Is that all, Rinpoche?" Tenzin asked after what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes. "For today, yes," the abbot replied, his eyes still closed. "Same time tomorrow." Tenzin walked back to his duties feeling more confused than enlightened. What kind of teaching was that? He'd been expecting wisdom, guidance, perhaps some special meditation technique that would help him break free from his funk. Instead, he'd watched an elderly monk hit a piece of wood with a hammer and then sit quietly. It felt almost anticlimactic. But you know what's interesting about the mind? Sometimes the simplest things lodge themselves in there and start working in ways we don't immediately understand. As Tenzin went about his day, sweeping the courtyard and helping in the kitchen, he found himself thinking about that single, sharp sound. Thok. There had been something so decisive about it, so completely present. The abbot hadn't been thinking about yesterday or tomorrow when he struck that post. He hadn't been worried about whether he was doing it right or wondering what other people would think. He had simply lifted the hammer and brought it down with complete attention. The next morning, Tenzin returned to the garden with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Maybe today there would be more explanation, more context. Maybe yesterday had just been some kind of preparation for the real teaching. But no, Abbot Lobsang was already there, sitting in the same peaceful posture, wearing the same gentle smile. They sat together in silence for a few minutes, watching the world wake up around them. Then, once again, the abbot rose, picked up the hammer, and struck the post once. Thok, set the hammer down, returned to the bench. This time, Tenzin didn't ask for explanation. Something told him that questions weren't what was wanted here, but his mind was certainly full of them. What was the point? Was this some kind of test of his patience? Was there some deep symbolic meaning he was missing? Day 3 was the same. Day 4 was the same. By day 5, Tenzin was beginning to feel a familiar frustration bubbling up inside him. Here he was, struggling with his practice, feeling disconnected and lost, and his teacher's solution was to hit a piece of wood once a day. It seemed almost absurd, but here's what was happening that Tenzin didn't yet recognize. Each morning, as he walked to the garden, he was actually looking forward to something for the first time in months. Not the hammer and the post, exactly, but the simple ritual of showing up, of sitting quietly with his teacher, of being part of something he didn't yet understand but that felt somehow important. The Buddha taught about what we call beginner's mind, that quality of openness and curiosity that we bring to new experiences before our clever thinking mind decides it knows what everything means. Tenzin's beginner's mind was slowly waking up, stirred by the mystery of this daily ritual. On the morning of day 6, something different happened. As they sat together in the usual comfortable silence, Tenzin found himself really listening to the sounds around them. Not just hearing them, but listening with his whole attention. The fountain trickling, a bird calling from somewhere in the pine trees, the rustle of prayer flags in the breeze. And then, When Abbot Lobsang struck the post, that clear, sharp thok seemed to cut through all the other sounds like a bell calling his mind home. For just a moment, Tenzin's busy, worried, self-judging mind went completely quiet. In that moment of perfect silence after the sound faded, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not the peace of having solved all his problems or figured out what the teaching meant, but the peace of being completely present with what was actually happening right now. It only lasted a few seconds before his thinking mind rushed back in with its usual commentary. Oh, that was nice. I should try to make that happen again. I wonder if that's what the abbot intended. Maybe I'm finally getting it. But for those few seconds, Tenzin had tasted something he'd almost forgotten existed. By day 7, he was beginning to suspect that the point wasn't to understand the teaching intellectually. The point was simply to show up, to be present, to allow whatever was happening to happen without needing to control it or figure it out, or make it mean something profound. This is one of the most beautiful aspects of authentic Dharma teaching. The real wisdom often comes not through explanations, but through direct experience. Not through thinking about truth, but through embodying it, even in the smallest ways. Day 8 brought rain, gentle mountain rain that made everything smell fresh and clean. Tenzin wondered if the daily ritual would continue in bad weather, but there was Abbot Lobsang, sitting peacefully on the bench with raindrops glistening on his robes like tiny jewels. The sound of the hammer striking the post was different in the rain, somehow softer but no less clear. Thok. And Tenzin realized that he had started to love this sound, to look forward to it the way a child looks forward to a bedtime story. On day 9, his mind was particularly restless. He'd had a difficult day before, full of the old familiar feelings of inadequacy and disconnection. As he sat beside his teacher, his internal chatter was louder than usual. This is pointless. I'm not getting anywhere. I should be working on real meditation techniques, not sitting here listening to someone hit a piece of wood. But when the hammer struck the post that morning, something remarkable happened. All that mental noise simply stopped. Not because he forced it to stop or because he had some great insight, but because the sound was so immediate, so present, that his mind had no choice but to come into this moment. And in that moment of presence, Tenzin suddenly understood something fundamental about what Abbot Lobsang was teaching him. It wasn't about the post or the hammer or any symbolic meaning. It was about the power of simple, repeated, mindful action. It was about showing up consistently, even when you don't feel like it, even when you don't understand why, even when your mind is convinced it's pointless. Day 10 arrived, and with it came the question that would change everything. As they sat together in their familiar silence, as the hammer struck the post with its now-beloved sound, Tenzin finally found the courage to speak the question that had been growing in his heart. "Rinpoche," he said softly, after the echo of the strike had faded into the mountain air, "what are you actually doing?" Abbot Lobsang turned to look at him, and his eyes were twinkling with the kind of joy that comes from watching a student ask exactly the right question at exactly the right time. Abbot Lobsang looked at Tenzin with those twinkling eyes, and for a moment the young monk thought he might finally receive a direct answer. Instead, the abbot stood up, walked over to the wooden post, and placed both hands on it. With a gentle but firm motion, he tried to push it over. The post didn't budge, not even a little. Then, to Tenzin's surprise, the abbot began to pull at the post, wrapping his arms around it and leaning back with his full weight. Still nothing. The post stood as solid and unmovable as the mountains themselves. Strange, Abbot Lobsang said, straightening his robes and returning to the bench. When I first started coming to this garden 40 years ago, you could move this post with just one finger. It was barely held in place, wobbling at the slightest touch. Tenzin looked at the post with new eyes. It seemed impossible that something so firmly rooted could have ever been loose. But Rinpoche, he said, how did it become so solid? The abbot smiled that gentle smile that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the mountains. One strike at a time, dear Tenzin. One strike at a time. Each day, that small tap of the hammer drove it a tiny bit deeper into the earth. Day after day, year after year, each small action creating something unshakable. And suddenly, like sunrise breaking over the peaks, Tenzin understood. The teaching wasn't about the post at all. It was about the mind. It was about the incredible power of small, consistent actions to transform something that seems impossible to change. You see, Abbot Lobsang continued, his voice as gentle as the morning breeze. Your mind has become like this post was when I first arrived, loose and unstable, knocked about by every passing thought and emotion. But just as this post became solid through countless small strikes, your mind can become unshakable through countless small acts of practice. The Buddha taught us about the power of what we call right effort, and this is exactly what Abbot Lobsang was showing Tenzin. Not the kind of effort that burns bright and then burns out, but the steady, patient effort of showing up again and again, even when we don't see immediate results. That afternoon, Tenzin sat in his room looking at his meditation cushion with completely new eyes. For months, he had been expecting each meditation session to solve all his problems, to transform his mind completely, to make him into the enlightened being he thought he should be. When that didn't happen, he had become discouraged, convinced that he was failing. But now he understood that each time he sat on that cushion, each time he returned his attention to his breath, each time he chose presence over distraction, he was striking his own inner post. He was slowly, gradually, building something solid and unshakable within himself. The next morning, Tenzin woke up before the bell rang. Not because he felt suddenly motivated or because all his problems had disappeared, but because he had made a simple decision the night before. He was going to show up for his life, one small action at a time. He sat on his meditation cushion, and his mind was still restless. Thoughts still came and went like clouds across the sky. But instead of judging himself for having thoughts, instead of giving up when his mind wandered, he simply noticed what was happening and gently returned his attention to his breath. Strike. Notice the mind has wandered. Strike. Return to the breath. Strike. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't blissful. It was just present. When the breakfast bell rang, instead of rushing to the dining hall, Tenzin took a moment to make his bed mindfully, smoothing the blanket with the same careful attention Abbot Lobsang brought to striking the post. Strike. In the kitchen, when it was his turn to chop vegetables, he focused completely on the task at hand. The weight of the knife in his hand, the crisp sound as it cut through carrots, the vibrant colors of the food that would nourish his community. Strike When another monk asked him how he was doing instead of the automatic fine that had become his habit, Tenzin paused and actually checked in with himself. "I'm learning," he said honestly. "I'm learning to be present. Strike." The beautiful thing about transformation is that it rarely happens the way we expect it to. We imagine it will be like a lightning bolt, sudden and dramatic. But real change, lasting change, is more like the way seasons shift. You don't notice it happening day by day, but one morning you wake up and realize that something fundamental has shifted. For Tenzin, this shift began to show itself in small ways. He started arriving at meditation on time, not because he had suddenly become disciplined, but because sitting quietly had begun to feel like coming home rather than facing judgment. He began to enjoy kitchen duty again, finding a simple pleasure in the rhythm of chopping and stirring and the quiet conversation of his Dharma brothers. Most remarkably, he began to notice beauty again. The way morning light painted the monastery walls gold, the sound of distant temple bells carried on the wind, the feeling of cool mountain air filling his lungs. These weren't new things, of course. They had been there all along. But Tenzin's capacity to receive them, to be present with them, had been slowly growing stronger with each day of practice. About 3 weeks after the teaching in the garden, something wonderful happened. Tenzin was sitting in meditation, and his mind was particularly busy that morning. Thoughts about the day ahead, memories from the past, judgments about his meditation, plans and worries and stories. The old Tenzin would have become frustrated, would have given up, would have decided that meditation wasn't working for him. But this Tenzin simply smiled. Not because the thoughts had stopped, but because he suddenly realized that having thoughts was perfectly normal, perfectly human. The practice wasn't about stopping thoughts. It was about changing his relationship with them. Each time he noticed his mind had wandered and gently brought it back, he was strengthening something precious. He was building his capacity to choose where to place his attention. Strike, notice, return, strike, notice, return. And in that moment, Tenzin felt something he hadn't experienced in months: joy. Not the excited kind of joy that comes from getting something you want, but the deep, quiet joy that comes from being fully present with what is. The other monks began to notice the change in him too, though they were too kind to comment directly. But they saw how he moved through his daily activities with more presence, more care. They heard him laugh again at meals, sharing in the gentle humor that made their simple community life so rich. They noticed that when he spoke, his words came from a place of genuine engagement, rather than the polite distance he had maintained for so many months. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Tenzin related to difficulty. Because, of course, challenges continued to arise. There were still days when meditation felt hard, when his mind was particularly restless, when old patterns of self-doubt would surface. But now, instead of seeing these difficulties as evidence that he was failing, he began to see them as opportunities to strengthen his practice. One particularly challenging morning, about a month after his conversation with Abbot Lobsang, Tenzin sat down to meditate, and his mind immediately launched into a familiar spiral of worry and self-criticism. In the past, this would have been the end of his meditation session. He would have gotten up, convinced that he was hopeless at this whole enlightenment thing. But that morning, he remembered the post in the garden. He remembered that even when the hammer strikes didn't seem to be making any difference, each one was still doing its work. So he stayed. When his mind said, "This is pointless, you're terrible at this," he simply noted, thinking, and returned to his breath. Strike. When his mind said, "You should give up, you're not cut out for the spiritual path," he noted, judging, and returned to his breath. Strike. When his mind said, "Everyone else is probably having profound realizations while you're just sitting here struggling," he noted, comparing, and returned to his breath. Strike. By the end of that meditation session, Tenzin's mind was no more quiet than when he had started. But something profound had happened. He had stayed present with difficulty without being overwhelmed by it. He had met his own mental patterns with kindness rather than judgment. He had practiced the most important skill any human being can develop, the ability to remain centered in the midst of inner storms. That afternoon, he found himself walking through the monastery with a lightness he hadn't felt in almost a year. Not because all his problems had been solved, but because he had rediscovered something precious that had been there all along. His own capacity for presence, for peace, for meeting each moment with an open heart. As he passed the practice garden, he saw Abbot Lobsang sitting on their familiar bench, and without hesitation, he went to join him. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the prayer flags dance in the afternoon breeze. After a while, the abbot turned to him with that gentle smile. "How is your post coming along?" he asked quietly. Tenzin closed his eyes and took a deep breath, checking in with himself honestly. He could feel something different inside, something more solid and stable than had been there before. Not perfect, not completely unshakable, but definitely stronger. Still working on it, he said with a smile of his own. "But I think I'm beginning to understand the process." "Ah," said Abbot Lobsang, "that is the most important understanding of all." 6 months had passed since that first morning in the practice garden, and Tenzin's days had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely new. The monastery looked the same. The bells rang at the same times. The mountains still stood in their eternal majesty around them. But something had fundamentally shifted in how Tenzin moved through this unchanging landscape. You know, there's a beautiful teaching in Buddhism about what happens when we begin to truly understand the Dharma. It's not that life becomes perfect or that we never face challenges. Rather, we develop what the Buddha called right view, a way of seeing that allows us to meet whatever arises with greater wisdom and compassion. For Tenzin, this new way of seeing was becoming as natural as breathing. Take this morning, for instance. He woke up feeling heavy and sad, the kind of inexplicable melancholy that sometimes visits us like weather rolling over the mountains. In the old days, this feeling would have derailed his entire day. He would have seen it as evidence that his practice wasn't working, that he was sliding backwards, that perhaps he really wasn't cut out for the spiritual path after all. But this morning, something different happened. As he felt that familiar weight settling over his heart, Tenzin simply noted it with gentle curiosity. "Ah," he said to himself, "sadness is here today. Not I am sad as if sadness defined his entire being, but sadness is here as if it were simply another visitor in the guest house of his awareness." He got up, made his bed with the same careful attention he brought to everything now, and walked to the meditation hall. As he sat on his cushion, He didn't try to push the sadness away or figure out why it was there. Instead, he brought the same steady presence to it that he had learned to bring to everything else. Strike. Notice what's here. Strike. Stay present. Strike. Trust the process. By the end of the meditation period, the sadness hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. It was still there, but now it felt more like a gentle rain than a heavy storm. And underneath it, Tenzin could feel something steady and unshakable, his own capacity to remain present with whatever was happening. This is what integration looks like in real life. It's not about becoming someone who never experiences difficult emotions. It's about developing the inner stability to meet all emotions, pleasant and unpleasant, with the same quality of presence and acceptance. After breakfast, as Tenzin was sweeping the courtyard, he noticed young Pemba, a monk who had arrived at the monastery just a few weeks earlier, sitting alone on a bench looking lost and overwhelmed. Tenzin recognized that look immediately. It was the same expression he had worn for months, the look of someone drowning in their own mind. Without thinking about it, Tenzin found himself walking over to sit beside the young monk, not to give advice or fix anything, but simply to offer the gift of presence that Abbot Lobsang had given him. "The mountains are beautiful this morning," Tenzin said quietly, gesturing toward the peaks that rose around them like ancient guardians. Pemba looked up, surprised to be noticed. "Yes," he said, though his voice suggested he hadn't really been seeing them at all. They sat together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Tenzin could feel something settle in the space between them. Finally, Pemba spoke. "I don't think I'm very good at this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Meditation, I mean, and, well, everything else too. Everyone else seems so peaceful, so together. But my mind is like a cage full of monkeys." Tenzin smiled, remembering his own monkey mind, which still made appearances from time to time. "You know," he said, "someone once told me that the goal isn't to quiet the monkeys. It's to become the kind of person who can remain peaceful even when the monkeys are chattering." This was what the Buddha meant when he spoke about the Bodhisattva ideal, the awakened being who remains in the world to help others find their way to freedom. Not because they have achieved some perfect state beyond all difficulty, but because they have learned to transform their own suffering into wisdom and compassion. Over the following weeks, Tenzin found himself naturally taking on this role for other struggling practitioners. Not as a teacher exactly, but as what we might call a spiritual friend, someone who had walked a similar path and could offer the quiet encouragement of their presence. When young Pemba would miss morning meditation, Tenzin would gently knock on his door. When another monk was struggling with doubt about his vocation, Tenzin would listen without judgment and share his own experience of dark nights of the soul. When someone was caught up in perfectionism about their practice, Tenzin would tell them about the wooden post and the power of imperfect but consistent effort. But perhaps the most profound teaching Tenzin offered was simply how he lived his daily life. The other monks began to notice something different about him, though they couldn't always put their finger on what it was. He seemed more present somehow, more genuinely engaged with whatever he was doing. When he was chopping vegetables, he was completely chopping vegetables. When he was listening to a Dharma talk, he was completely listening. When he was walking to the meditation hall, he was completely walking. This quality of wholehearted presence is what the Buddha called right mindfulness, and it has a mysterious way of affecting everyone around us. Without saying a word about transformation or enlightenment, Tenzin was demonstrating what it looks like to live with an integrated practice. One afternoon, as he was working in the monastery garden, actually tending vegetables this time rather than contemplating wooden posts, Abbot Lobsang appeared beside him. The old teacher often seemed to materialize out of nowhere, as if he had a special radar for exactly when his students needed guidance. "The tomatoes are coming along beautifully," the abbot observed, kneeling down to examine the plants with the same attention he brought to everything. "Yes," Tenzin agreed, "though some of them are taking longer to ripen than others." Abbot Lobsang chuckled softly. "Wise tomatoes. They know that real ripening can't be rushed." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, their hands moving in the familiar rhythm of weeding and watering. Finally, the abbot spoke again. "You know, Tenzin, when I first started bringing you to the practice garden, I wasn't entirely sure how the teaching would unfold. The post has been there for 40 years, but each student who encounters it receives something slightly different." Tenzin paused in his weeding. "What did you hope I would learn?" "Nothing specific," the abbot replied. "I simply trusted that if you could learn to show up consistently, with patience and presence, you would discover what you needed to discover. The Dharma has its own intelligence. Our job is simply to create the conditions for it to reveal itself. This is one of the most beautiful aspects of authentic spiritual teaching. The teacher doesn't try to force the student into a predetermined mold. Instead, they create a container, a safe space, a set of conditions that allow the student's own wisdom to emerge naturally." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Tenzin felt a deep gratitude welling up in his heart, not just for Abbot Lobsang's skillful guidance, but for his own willingness to trust the process even when he couldn't see where it was leading. "Rinpoche," he said quietly, "I think I understand now why you never explained what the post was about in the beginning." "Oh," the abbot said, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "If you had told me it was about building consistency and inner stability, I would have tried to achieve those things directly. I would have made it into another goal to accomplish, another way to judge my progress. But by keeping it simple, by just asking me to show up, you allowed the transformation to happen naturally." Abbot Lobsang nodded slowly. "The Buddha taught that wisdom can't be given, only discovered. We can point the way, but each person must walk the path for themselves." As they gathered their gardening tools and prepared to head back to the monastery for evening prayers, Tenzin reflected on how different his life felt now compared to a year ago. The external circumstances were nearly identical. He was still the same young monk, living in the same small room, following the same daily schedule. But the inner landscape had been completely transformed. Where there had once been anxiety, there was now a growing sense of inner steadiness. Where there had once been self-judgment, there was now a gentle acceptance of his humanity. Where there had once been disconnection from his community, there was now a felt sense of belonging and purpose. And perhaps most importantly, where there had once been despair about his spiritual progress, there was now an unshakable trust in the process itself. He had learned that transformation doesn't happen according to our timeline or our expectations. It happens in its own time, in its own way, when we create the right conditions and then get out of the way. That night, as Tenzin settled into his evening meditation, he closed his eyes and for just a moment, he imagined he could hear it, the sound that had become the soundtrack to his transformation. Thok, the sound of the hammer striking the post, the sound of consistent effort creating something unshakable, the sound of an ordinary human being discovering their own extraordinary capacity for presence, peace, and wisdom. Strike by strike, breath by breath, moment by moment. This, he had learned, was how awakening actually happened. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of Tenzin's story, though of course, his journey continues each day, just as yours does and mine does. Because that's the beautiful thing about the Dharma. It's not a destination we arrive at once and then we're done. It's a way of being that we cultivate moment by moment, breath by breath, choice by choice. As I sit here with you now, sharing this ancient wisdom in our modern world, I'm struck by how perfectly Tenzin's experience mirrors what so many of us face in our daily lives. You might not live in a monastery or have a wise abbot as your teacher, but I guarantee you have your own wooden post, your own opportunity to practice consistency and presence. Maybe your wooden post is your morning meditation, even if it's just 5 minutes of quiet breathing before the day begins. Maybe it's the moment you pause before reacting when someone says something that triggers you. Maybe it's choosing to really listen when your partner or your child or your friend is speaking, instead of planning what you're going to say next. The Buddha taught us that enlightenment isn't some distant, mystical state reserved for monks and masters. It's available right here, right now, in the most ordinary moments of our lives. Every time we choose presence over distraction, every time we respond with kindness instead of reactivity, every time we meet our own imperfections with compassion rather than judgment, we're striking our inner post. You know what I love most about Abbot Lobsang's teaching method? He didn't give Tenzin a complicated meditation technique or a long list of spiritual practices to master. He simply asked him to show up consistently to something very simple. One strike, one day at a time. This is the essence of what Buddhists call the middle way. Not the extreme of harsh self-discipline that burns us out, and not the extreme of spiritual laziness that lets us drift through life unconsciously, but the gentle, steady commitment to keep showing up, even when we don't feel like it, even when we can't see immediate results. I think about the people listening to this story right now, and I imagine some of you might be feeling a bit like Tenzin felt in those early days of struggle. Maybe you've been trying to meditate regularly, but keep missing days. Maybe you've been working on being more patient with your family, but find yourself snapping at them when you're tired. Maybe you've been attempting to cultivate gratitude, but keep getting caught up in complaint and worry. If that's you, I want you to know something important. You're not broken. You're not failing. You're not hopeless at this whole spiritual growth thing. You're simply human, and being human means that transformation happens gradually, imperfectly, with plenty of setbacks along the way. The invitation is simply to keep striking your post. Keep showing up to your practice, whatever that looks like for you. Keep choosing presence when you remember to. Keep returning to kindness when you notice you've wandered into judgment. Not because you're trying to become some perfect version of yourself, but because each small act of mindfulness, each moment of choosing love over fear, each breath taken with conscious awareness is valuable in and of itself. In the Buddhist tradition, we have a beautiful practice called dedication of merit. At the end of our meditation sessions or Dharma teachings, we take whatever wisdom or peace or positive energy has been generated, and we mentally offer it for the benefit of all beings. We recognize that our individual awakening is never separate from the awakening of all life. So as we come to the end of our time together today, I'd like to invite you to take a moment to feel whatever sense of peace or inspiration or gentle motivation might have arisen from hearing Tenzin's story. Maybe you're feeling a renewed commitment to your own daily practice. Maybe you're feeling more compassion for your own struggles. Maybe you're simply feeling the quiet satisfaction of having spent these minutes in contemplation rather than scrolling through your phone. Whatever is here for you, see if you can offer it silently for the benefit of everyone who, like Tenzin, like you, like me, is walking this sometimes difficult but ultimately beautiful path of awakening. May the young mother who's trying to stay patient with her toddler while working from home find the strength to keep practicing. May the elderly gentleman who sits alone each morning trying to meditate away his grief feel held by the vast compassion of the universe. May the teenager who's struggling with anxiety and depression discover their own unshakable inner stability, one breath at a time. The Buddha's final words, according to the ancient texts, were work out your salvation with diligence. Not achieve enlightenment quickly or become perfect immediately, but work out your salvation with diligence. Keep showing up. Keep practicing. Keep striking your post with patience and faith and the understanding that every small effort matters. And remember, you're not walking this path alone. Across the centuries, countless beings have faced the same struggles you face, have felt the same doubts you feel, have experienced the same moments of breakthrough and setback that characterize every authentic spiritual journey. You're part of an ancient and continuing tradition of human beings who have decided that awakening is possible, that freedom is our birthright, that love is stronger than fear. Tenzin continues his daily practice in that mountain monastery, and each morning he still meets Abbot Lobsang in the practice garden. The wooden post is so deeply embedded now that it would take a team of strong monks to move it. But they still strike it once each day, not because it needs to be driven any deeper, but because the ritual itself has become a celebration of the power of consistency, a daily reminder that transformation is always possible, one moment at a time. And somewhere in your own life, in your own daily rhythm, there's a practice waiting for you. Maybe it's already there and you just need to return to it with fresh commitment. Maybe it's something new that's calling to you. Listen for it, trust it, begin it, and then with the patience of mountains and the persistence of flowing water, keep showing up to it, one day at a time. May you walk in peace, dear friends. May you find your own wooden post and the wisdom to strike it daily with love. And may all beings everywhere awaken to their own inherent freedom and joy. Until we meet again in the Dharma, thank you for sharing this journey with me. Sleep well, practice gently, and remember that enlightenment is always just one conscious breath away.